So good evening, everyone. My name is Ida Benke. I'm co-curator of the biennial LCBH Patterns in Resistance. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you all and to introduce our two speakers for tonight, Sophie Lewis and Nazila Kivi, who for the next hour and a half will speak about technology, reproductive utopias, and various practices of insurgent care. Tonight's conversation is a part of the a series of seminars titled Hysterical Utopias, which has been co-produced by LCBH and Salon Hysteria. LCBH is an independent art biennial gathering selected institutional partners, artists, and contemporary artist-run and alternative exhibition spaces across Europe. It is hosted by the Factory for Design and Arts in Copenhagen, and this year's iteration of the biennial is titled Patterns in Resistance, and it is curated by the Laboratory for Aesthetics and Ecology, which I am part of. So that is why I'm welcoming you all here tonight. Patterns in Resistance was originally planned as a physical manifestation, but due to COVID-19, it has been moved to the digital world. And the biennial unfolds within themes and knots between crafts and technologies, histories of labor, resistance, of care, and the building of communities. And I just will recommend you all to follow us on our website, lcbh.dk, and also on social media, where we will present digital artworks and online seminars, workshops, etc. for the next couple of months. No, for the next couple of weeks. We go until September 19th. So let me introduce you to today's speakers. Sophie Lewis is a theorist, critic, and translator living in Philadelphia. She publishes her work on topics ranging from dating to Donnay Haraway, on both scholarly and non-academic platforms, including Boston Review, Viewpoint, Science as Culture, Jacobin, The New Inquiry, Mute, and Salvage Quarterly. A feminist committed to cyborg ecology and queer communism, she is a member of the Out of the Woods Collective and an editor at Blindfield, a journal of cultural inquiry. And Full Surrogacy Now is her first book, and it's published by Verso. Nazila Kivi is an independent scholar on reproduction and decoloniality, editor, essayist, and co-founder of the feminist magazine Friction. She teaches gender study courses, among others, the course From Witches to Cyborgs, Gender, Race, and Resistance. And Nazila Kivi is also the founder of Salon Hysteria, a platform for conversations on society, politics, and science. So I want to say thank you again, Sophie and Nazila, for being with us tonight and for sharing your work with us. And now I will pass on this Zoom room to the two of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ida, for the generous presentation. And hi, everyone who's joining us. And hi, Sophie. Thank you for being with us this afternoon, or it's pre-noon at your location. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with you today. And before we go ahead, I just want to give a quick outline for our listeners out there, for our viewers, to just so you know what we're going to talk about. So Sophie, we're mostly going to talk about your book and our reflections on that. Your book is called Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family, and going to introduce that and then start with some of the most important and basic for understanding the further conversation concepts that you introduce in that. And from there, we're going to go to the history of family, abolition, and maybe even talk about love. What's love got to do with it? And we are going to conclude with talking about technologies of reproduction and insurgent care, and utopianism as a method. And I hope we're going to ask, Ida will be with us the whole time, and we're going to ask if you're going to need a break, because sometimes it can be too hard to stick for an hour and a half. So, welcome. How is it where you are? How's the weather?
Oh, it's been storming.
Wow, okay.
Very intensely. So huge buildup of humidity and heat, and then giving way to lots of thunder and lightning.
Oh, that sounds exactly like here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. And we have a lot to cover. I guess I will introduce my book first.
I'm going to guide you through it all.
Fantastic.
Not that you need it, but just to guide our listeners and viewers to
No, I can't imagine a better interlocutor in many ways than, you know, someone who is thinking, sort of teaching about the witch cyborg kind of dialectic. It's a sort of returning problematic, I think, which I have these kinds of ongoing, many years long internal dialogues with figures like Donnay Haraway and Silvia Federici kind of undergirding this whole project. But you know, I am currently not an academic, which gives me a little bit of, I mean, I don't have a job is the other less glamorous way of saying that. I didn't try so hard to get one after my PhD. But you know, the fact remains that's also my, you know, that's my sort of economic position of you know, selling utopian theory for money on a marketplace in a pandemic. There are advantages and disadvantages, just like there are, as I understand it, to having the relative security of being inside an academic institution in this moment. What is sort of interesting to note about the genesis of my book, Full Surrogacy Now, is that it began as, I suppose you could almost say, a little bit of a family abolitionist rebellion against my academic supervisors. I didn't know that I was going to end up speaking exclusively in my thesis about so-called reproduction. I say so-called because as we will hopefully have time to get into later, the premise that reproduction actually occurs in our species is something that you know, Marxist biologists and feminist sort of science studies has really called into question, right? But initially I was someone who began in English literature and moved into human geography with an interest in grappling with what human geographers call the production of nature. So I was a climate activist, a queer feminist activist, and I was very intellectually interested in the potential interrelation of anti-work theory in the Marxist tradition. So, you know, I am situated, amongst other things, in a genealogy with Italian autonomist feminism and the scholarship of Kathy Weeks, whose version of Marxist feminism does not depend on a vision of unalienated labor. And then on the other hand, this shibboleth nature, which Marxist geographers publish an immense amount of work on. And I was actually pitching a PhD that was, you know, fairly abstract. I was going to talk about ecology and work, nature and labor. And in a way, that is also what ended up happening. But through arguments with my advisors about the ultimate authority of a sort of humanist definition of labor power that really accepts the boundary of the body, that boundary that, you know, theorists like Donnay Haraway have really called into question, while remaining loyal in a certain sense, disloyally loyal to Marx, have called into question. So I began kind of seeking examples, you know, reaching for case studies, or just off the top of my head, you know, sites of labor that really troubled the sovereignty of the human and the sort of masculinist productivist definition of what labor is. And I raised the topic of pregnancy, which is so, you know, over discussed and yet paradoxically under discussed. It's such a fascinating site of xeno-hospitality, right? A relation to the alien. It's a site that really enables us to talk about the more than human, what Haraway calls, you know, the condition of being human as a multi-species relationship, you know, and so much more, you know, questions of value generation, questions of the property form, and you know, anthrogenesis, which is a fancy way of saying the manufacture of human beings, as you know, as one of the sources of capitalist accumulation, because, you know, because humans are the bearers of labor power, but you know, we literally get manufactured underwater in amniotic fluid, and although, as I say, culture has talked about this in many ways, with, you know, via the prism of the institution of motherhood, I felt it was kind of under discussed as simply a form of work. I mean, I wanted to almost stubbornly reject what comes before a pregnancy and what comes after it, and really just focus kind of pig-headedly on the nature of that co-production that happens with, you know, mediated by the placenta. And then so basically I moved away from my eco-Marxist abstract project and started trying to defend my instincts or curiosities about both waged and unwaged pregnancy. And that way of framing it is itself, in a sense, my intervention, or one of my interventions. I propose that we can, you know, reject the naturalized difference between so-called surrogacy and natural reproduction. I would like to think about solidarity between people who do pregnancy within contracts for pay and people who do it, you know, under the aegis of the family. So that was kind of the origin point, and I think I've taken quite a long time now just answering that very first question, but it was a sort of counterintuitive road into this book, which I suppose also means that it's an uncomfortable fit in certain disciplinary silos, you know. It's actually, strangely enough, not a book about gender, or rather, it's not a book that talks explicitly about gender. It kind of tries to demonstrate that you can talk about this ultra-naturalized topic of baby making without putting the question of gender front and center. And it is also not a book about reproductive technology in a straightforward way. My sense was that the academic conversation about assisted reproduction was taking too many things for granted. For instance, the idea that some other reproduction is unassisted, right? I felt like the whole topic was, you know, accepting the terms of the capitalist industry's definition of kinship, of biogenetic kind of entitlement and inheritance, when in fact it should be kind of positioning itself more critically so as to explode these categories. You know, when as academics we talk about motherhood on the one hand and then reprotech on the other, or you know, we have sociological studies about families and maternity, and then a completely different topic involves, you know, the legislation around surrogacy and so on. And I'm not disputing there's a huge amount of incredible work being done on surrogacy. My book spends a huge amount of time discussing its colonial or neo-colonial, its racializing, its whiteness preserving functions. It is clearly an industry, the commercial gestational surrogacy industry, to be clear, you know, that is rife with abuses, with problems, with intense, you know, reasons to wage a labor struggle for workers' liberation. So, you know, I don't think anyone could read my book and mistake me as someone who apologizes for this industry. But my project is also to reject the assumption that we should talk about that industry as though it is its own field. I also want to remember, because I think feminists as a whole have often somehow, you know, acquired a tendency to forget since the 80s that the invisible default site of baby making, the household, is also still a fucking problem, right? It's to just join the two sites so that we don't end up bioconservatively implying that everything is okay until surrogacy comes along and commodifies certain things. The problem, as I see it, is much more structural. It's a circuit that includes and begins with, in a sense, the nuclear family. So these are not separate topics. When I say full surrogacy now, there are sort of two principal meanings. One of them is a dystopian diagnosis of the situation we are in, right? We have a situation of reproductive stratification where, in a deeply classed and racialized way, care, labor, and life-making labor is extracted from the global south, the south within the north, you know, the proletariat, and sort of racialized, feminized populations locally, in order to produce this image of an autonomous, almost self-reproducing, structurally speaking, white household, a private household. So in fact, it looks like an entity that we can talk about, but it has all these invisible surrogates excluded from the family portrait, reproducing it or producing it. In a sense, you might say that I'm increasingly not convinced that making production distinctions makes sense. And then the other meaning of full surrogacy now is the utopian sense, where I am dreaming, speculating in a utopian mode that the latent reality, which is, as I say, currently very violently organized, that we are the makers of one another. Quite literally, we are connected to one another in ways far more diffuse and distributed and tentacular and sort of threatening than the nuclear family story suggests. That latent reality could be sort of actualized such that we act like it. We act like we are actually responsible for one another in the deepest sense. We are literally the makers of one another, and that sort of completely maximally actualized relationship of care and mutuality and conflict, and politics and dissensus would be, a situation of full surrogacy that would have, proliferated social reproductive co-imbrication to such an extent that the nuclear family would be abolished sort of from within, an explosion, a proliferation, rather than a simple negation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll pause now because otherwise I'll never shut up.
So thank you very much. You almost gave a full of the whole talk, which is great because now we can dive into some points. And I would like to start also to just have you outline some concepts for people who are newcomers to this subject. But first I want to say I got especially 2 points out of what you just introduced, is that I don't read you as being like a proponent of surrogacy or an opponent of that, but more as someone who wants to like put out or uncover how surrogacy in a way is become, the way I understand you, somehow othered in a way to put some types of reproduction like outside of the scope of the normal, and then some parts as this natural. So making one thing seem as unnatural or commercialized is part of making the other naturalized. While I see your point as saying that whether it's a commercial surrogacy or reproduction within the institution of nuclear family, it's all on the same spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that in my book, the way I approach it is to disbelieve the word surrogacy. It's like rather than accepting that that's a name that makes sense for a particular practice, I'm kind of doing this. It's a sort of childlike utopian move almost. It's like, hang on, what is the definition here? Someone does a pregnancy to create a baby that is going to be somebody else's property. I mean, that's what is happening. But if we remember, what people used to be quite militant about in the queer liberation struggle, the gay liberation struggle, women's liberation in the 70s and 60s, and to some extent early 80s, children don't belong to anyone, right? We used to have these sensibilities about how, in the phrase of the sisterhood of Black single mothers, for instance, children belong to all of us, which means they belong, amongst other things, only to themselves. So, what are you telling me is surrogacy? It's a production of a certain kind of kinship as property status. But if you believe that children don't belong to anyone, the natural difference between the family and surrogacy or whatever, the natural unassisted household. And again, just to stress, all reproduction is assisted. That is a really basic principle of of life, biologically speaking, or in Marxist political economy, or whatever you like, right? I mean, this is, in a sense, the true content of that. I don't know if it's so common in the Netherlands, but the phrase "it takes a village," you might be familiar.
In Denmark, you mean?
Oh,
yeah.
I'm so sorry.
We are kind of similar. We all have bikes.
No, you're not. That was a really stupid slip.
No,
I'm sorry.
It's fine.
I was just emailing someone. I was just emailing someone from the Netherlands.
So I just thought maybe there was something specific with the Netherlands. But thank you for expanding on that, I would like to. It's because I think it's important for people who don't know about your book to really like emphasize that it's not like directly about surrogacy in itself, but it's about using surrogacy as a departure point to think broader about reproduction, kinship, the idea of family, and care. And for that, I would really like you to also, as an introduction to newcomers, because the subtitle of your book is Feminism Against Family. And I would like to ask you two questions in that. The first is just define what is family abolition for someone who doesn't know what it is. Yeah, and I'll get to the other first, but first just a short definition just to put the concepts out here.
Yes. So there are different ways of, presenting this very outrageous kind of proposition. And, some of them are a little bit more, conciliatory and, diplomatic than others. And over the course of the, year and a half that I've been, explaining and learning also what it is that I kind of published with Verso, I've had an interesting kind of learning curve. Sometimes I have the impulse to assuage people's fears. We have deeply emotional reactions when someone comes along and says, abolish the family. I mean, interestingly enough, that emotional response, although it has been present for the 200 years that this idea has existed amongst utopian socialists, though it was also less controversial in the 60s and 70s among the liberationist milieu, and also in the late 19th century, people were talking about it almost as a central plank of socialism, really. I mean, figures we associate with family abolition include Charles Fourier and his kind of Fourierist phalansteries, which were sort of communes, blueprints for a mode of cohabitation with a certain number of people. His were quite big, as I recall. Alexandra Kollontai, right? And then, moving into what is, I think, unhelpfully called the second wave of feminism. Shulamith Firestone, who also had some, concrete suggestions for how people should cohabit in a way that would leave the premises, the logics, and the functional, the function of the private nuclear household for capitalism behind. And for her, it had to do with, amongst other things, children's liberation, the right that children have by virtue of being our comrades and human beings to have some kind of say over how and who they live with, right? But I've noticed that sometimes I tell people, don't worry, the visceral emotional reaction you're having, it's misplaced. Family abolition only means something already latently present amongst us, right? This is also true.
I just, sorry to interrupt, but I just really liked what you said about that family abolition is not about destroying something or getting rid of the way we understand already existing forms of kinship, but also about expanding those and expanding the idea of, for example, that is only blood relations that count.
I mean, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. You can tell people, don't worry, it's about proliferating relations of care. And it's true, in the classical Hegelian sense, Aufhebung, abolition, it means preserving the kernel of something, that is present in reality, and following its logic through such that it is universalized. And so the explosion of the actually existing state of things is accomplished paradoxically by, you know, by generalizing a feature of that present. So this is why I sometimes have recently started talking about the idea of the family as a kind of utopia, right? I mean, it's a beautiful idea. We have a desire for unconditional love, support, and care, and for instance, babies absolutely deserve unconditional, stable, unstinting, reliable care and love. Although that word is so controversial and difficult, both words, care and love. But the thing is also, I maybe this is just where you find me in 2020. I do also want to insist on the scary, you know, function of this phrase, family abolition. Yes, you know, it does mean, and this is the same with prison abolition, right? All the people talking about the abolition of the police and prisons are also talking about building, not simply destroying, right? We need to make a world in which the infrastructures we currently have for reproducing one another would be unthinkable, right? Literally unthinkable. And in order to get there, you know, we would have to produce abundance. It would have to be a situation of revolution inseparable from all the other components of anti-capitalist revolution. But, you know, the other thing is, the discomfort we feel is, I mean, and when I say we, I'm also talking about my situatedness. You know, I am someone who, you know, has certain kinds of, you know, queer dispossession in relation to the bionuclear family, but in other important ways. You know, I have, you know, all the wages of whiteness that have been generated through the private nuclear household, particularly in its interrelation with the nation and with class and citizenship. You know, when we talk about the injustice, the structural injustice of the private nuclear household, it is quite appropriate to feel a sort of fear, like a very primal fear, at the suggestion of taking that away, right? It's our, particularly as privileged subjects, we have a lot to lose, but even as you know, marginalized, dispossessed, you know, xenophobically persecuted, etc. Subjects, the private nuclear household and the biological family is often the only source of respite and of nurture and of escape from the violence of the police, the state, etc. that we have. So it is always both, right? The nuclear household is where a sort of cis-normative, punitive, disciplinary version of gender and race and worker subjectivity gets produced, you know. It's where the vast majority of certain kinds of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse, rape, all kinds of, you know, brutalities, physical and psychological, take place in that supposed sanctuary, right? And at the same time, it is a real sanctuary from certain kinds of predation, exploitation, and extraction. So, you know, it makes sense to feel fear that in the absence of family, we would be left with nothing. But paradoxically, and this is maybe something that certain communities around the world have experienced with COVID, it's kind of the opposite. It's kind of when, you know, when the family becomes exposed as the deeply sort of insufficient and fictional in many ways sort of infrastructure that it is, that we, that we begin to find one another and to build a sort of genuine abundance. But the paradox is that the desire for family is in itself a little bit utopian. We use it as a metaphor for everything that we want. When we talk about, feeling commitment and affinity with something or someone, we talk about it in terms of kinship. Even the CEOs of corporations, when they email you trying to convince you to, become a customer again, they talk about you as family, right? And we talk about family relations whenever we want to sort of ameliorate the character of something potentially a little bit brutal, like the relation between a human and a pet, or a zookeeper and an animal, or a boss and an employee, right? But it's not. That's not to say that the idea is sick. When we we wish to extend it to everyone, and that, in a sense, already accomplishes the explosion of the idea that family abolitionists are talking about. Because if everyone can be family, then the idea of the family as a kind of bounded mini nation state, in and of itself ceases to function. With the nation state being kind of the bigger version of that same logic of a little team that is sovereign, that has privatized ecosystem services and free housework for its self-reproduction, that has a certain kind of competitive logic, that the nation state is biopolitically responsible.
Now you're jumping to all the questions that I sent you. I think you've been through like 10 of them for now. So I'm going to interrupt you because something I've been thinking about while preparing for this talk has been the subject of love. And I have thought about it because it really hit me how this idea of, would you say, atomizing care or redistributing care is really connected to the concept of love. And I used to teach a course that's called Families Without Borders, from adoptions to transnational desires. And one of the first things I used to do with my students was to send them out on the street to stop random people on the street, like as a mini field work, and to ask people like, who do you love the most? And to put like a ranking order of who you love the most, and then come back to the class and compare with how does that fit with, for example, institutional way of love hierarchy? Because I think that's the whole problem with love, is that there is a hierarchy in love, in whom you can love according to the state, according to different institutions, according to, for example, in Denmark, the asylum authorities, or if you want to do like family or partner reunification, there is definitely a hierarchy in love, like whose love is acknowledged as love, and what kinds of, what type of people's love. I've also worked within reproductive health for migrants and minority women in Denmark. And there is also, for example, this idea that some type of women love their children more than other kind of women, right? So I've even heard like some people say like, oh, women from this and this country, they don't care as much about their children or bodies as we do here in Denmark. So there is like this hierarchy of whose love is more important. And I think that's also something that goes back to the like radical feminist history, is this like critique of marriage is very much bound with the critique of love, that the idea of love that also makes you provide unpaid labor within the household. And what I think is really interesting is you mentioned Shulamit Firestone, and I would like to mention a Danish writer who is still writing, luckily, but this book is from 1973. It's called Fri os fra kærligheden by Susanne Brøgger. I think Ida maybe has a picture of the English version. Do you have that, Ida?
Yeah.
Deliver Us from Love. And this book is still really really relevant. I think, and it's a book of essays who is a critique of love and critique of family. And number 2 is called From Nuclear Family to Nuclear Weapon, which I think is really saying for also we talked about yesterday about how the idea of having this boundary within one nuclear family, and then the boundary of the family as a unit within a capitalist system, and that those units making boundaries of the nation state. Because, for example, the whole idea of pronatalism, the state asking to make more children, is also about protecting some imaginary or very real physical borders. And what I think is really interesting is that I just wanted to use this book also to, I mean, I can recommend everyone to read it. Luckily, it's been translated to English as well. But I think that something that's really interesting that made me also think about your book is that Susanne Brøgger writes that there are several reasons that also the nuclear family is unable to control its own consumption. So a nuclear family is trying to mimic the way the society works by this big households, and it changes from the minute you go from being one person to being two persons. So if you live alone, usually you don't have a dishwasher or what's it called, a washing machine and all those things. But the second you are two persons, you start getting all those appliances and you start to consume in a different way, as this, like, as if you were like a big household, even starting with the number of two people. And I think that's really interesting to also depart from that. Is how do you see, apart from this consumption, how do you see the family as, that's what I wanted to ask also in the beginning, is how do you see family as partly as a, like a cover up for a very specific ideology that has become, we have been led to understand it as a natural way of being. That's partly one. And the other is, how is this naturalization of family, how is it connected to capitalism? If you want to know, okay, how does really a feminist critique of capitalism function when you get into the this ideology, I would call it, or fiction as you call it, of family? Can you say something on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are many different stories about the specific way for Marxists that the family has sort of continued, almost zombie-like, to be central to disciplinary forms of, you know, both neoconservatism and neoliberalism depend on the family. This is the recent account of Melinda Cooper in her book Family Values, which Sarah Bruyette had a great line reviewing. She points out that, you know, we tend to say, you know, that the nuclear family is being destroyed, but she wrote, as Melinda Cooper shows, you know, the nuclear family is not dead enough. And in fact, this story, this nostalgia about how it is on its way out and we are losing it, is part and parcel of its own logic. It's almost like they go together, the disciplinary logic of the family and the idea that we need to bring the family back. But initially, the pre-capitalist household, and the etymological kind of root of family was basically a property logic. There was an ownership relation between the head of the household, patriarchal head of the household, and the wife, the children, the servants. And over time, with the launch of capitalism, with the invention of these doubly free workers, which needed to be reproduced privately within households, after they had been severed from the commons, severed from common modes of reproduction, that they needed to be, rendered able to return to work for free within private households, which is also why you have kind of the emergence of, and this is Federici's account of history, amongst others. You have the persecution of figures, structurally queer figures, I would say, who sought to exceed and contest that privatizing, atomizing logic. So you have the notion that gossips are bad, people who sort of stand at the garden gate and seek to continue the common weaving of the community with one another are somehow nefarious or threatening to the emergent order. And you have fictions, of biological replication, inheritance as, a matter of literally, passing yourself on through the ages, ensuring your immortality. The invention of children is part of this story, and of childhood as a condition in which one is malleable, almost like a slate on which a parent authors his legacy. And of course, there are all kinds of ways in which biopolitically the family is the story we have for accounting for populations. Who is allowed in or out of things, who is allowed to visit who in hospital, who is allowed to inherit what, who is required to testify against who and in what way. It's part of a logic that encourages a sort of privatization of the mind, and a sort of competitive logic, because once again wealth gets privately shored up, largely through private households, and then over time via classes. We have a notion as well that the notion of the biological family is reliable and respected across all races, quote unquote, in liberal democracy, but it's obviously not true. For instance, in the US, there was talk at one point under the current, basically fascioid administration, of testing the DNA of migrants trying to cross the border from Mexico into the United States to sort of see whether these were legitimate family members, because the US stands for family values, and if you were arriving as a genetic package, then you would somehow accrue the benefits and the privileges that this nation accords to such families. And it's obviously not, it's just not true, right? So you can then begin to find your way back to the very important other origin story of the family, which is a racial one, and specifically an anti-Black one, this is Hortense Spillers, amongst other people, accounting for the creation of not just the family, but inextricably naturalized binary gender on the plantation. You had to have certain kinds of bodies whose production of babies had no moral claim, and certainly no property claim. So enslaved Black women on the plantation were defined in America, and I realize I am just talking about you know, the United States history here, which is a problem because it's not universalizable across the world. There are different genealogies in Europe of this same colonial logic. But what Hortense Spillers says is that the machine of gender is inextricable from the invention of the private nuclear family. In order to have women and men, daughters and sons in the bourgeois mode, you have to have Black bodies that are not women, not parents. And those two things, you know, in what she calls her American grammar book, are indivisible from one another. In order to be a fully gendered subject in the mode of the family, you have to basically structurally be white. So that the phrase Black families is a kind of oxymoron. Although the other important thing to note in that sense is that real solidarity, you know, real subscribence, real care, real comradeliness, real family has paradoxically, you know, almost exclusively been developed as an art, as a wisdom, as a potency collectively amongst those populations that have been excluded from the ideology of the private nuclear family. So families against the family is the way that we have to think about this. You know, it is the real sort of resistant kinships against kinship, you know, that will advance this dialectic through history.
I also would like to talk about, because we are reaching the end of our talk, so I want to talk about something that I found interesting is, you know, a lot of people would say like, okay, what you're suggesting is a utopia, it cannot be done, there is some kind of naturalness about how families work. But I would like to talk about how can we think of, because when I move between the academic and then the fiction and the art world and activism, I really think of them like as a continuum of one thing. And I think this utopian thinking that I could also call speculative fiction or speculation, right, is it can be a method in itself to think in a different way, to think like, what if we could imagine a world that is completely different from how it is, and then use the speculation or the fabulation in itself as a method to academically or scientifically go to another place. Yeah. So I would like to hear also, maybe shortly this time, so we can also get the important question of insurgent care, to hear about like what is your point of departure, like what have you used to go into this, like speculation, or maybe it's not speculative fiction, maybe we can call it speculative nonfiction, because like what has inspired you into this, into the method?
Yeah, I mean, I remember you know, reading Shulamith Firestone, who is, amongst other things, you know, wildly and offensively off base in her chapter about race, which is a big problem, but whose mind I felt a certain kind of affinity with. I mean, I'm saying affinity instead of kinship because, you know, we can only work with the with small semantic kinds of attempts to shift our our frame in the present. But I felt as though her dysphoric rejection of, you know, common premises about how to live life was exactly, you know, the same as that love and rage I feel in my heart. My common sense, you know, that the private nuclear family is not, you know, the source of ultimate satisfaction, particularly for queer people. I mean, and that's not a trivial point, you know. There are many people who are, you know, in a sense, refugees from families because that, you know, they will be brutalized and killed within that supposed sanctuary and that place where, in fact, you are bullied into being, right? Particularly in pandemics, right? Stay at home. But whose home? You know, am I going to be murdered there? Shelter in place. Well, whose place? You know, let's be, you know, historical materialists about the power relations in, you know, an unequal rented or owned property, you know. And then, of course, the homophobic and queerphobic violence that takes place often within biological structures. So Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, you know, there's this line in it, and by the way, I'm talking about this text as a utopian manifesto and a speculative fiction, particularly the second half of that book, rather than as a second wave feminist treatise, which it is not. It's a sort of time traveling speculative future, you know, way out of step with many of its contemporaries. She writes, feminism, when it truly achieves its goals, will crack through the most basic structures of our society. And that's, you know, that's a dream that I remain wedded to. When I don't know if Ida would be happy to show my little illustrative image of that notion of cracking through the most basic structures of our society. It's the Disney Alice in Wonderland image where, you know, because I think, yeah, you'll be familiar with this, you know, she is, you know, she's literally breaking out of this house and the rabbit inside it who is trying to enlist her, he's mistaking her for Mary Ann, you know, the maid or the housekeeper. Thanks, Ida, that's cool. He literally cannot see her anymore because she has exploded to become so large that he cannot identify her as a person anymore. And she is not Mary Ann, she is Alice. But then she becomes so small that she can escape the webs of that expectation that she perform free reproductive labor. So to answer your question about my inspirations, basically, I can only talk about little glimpses like that, little images, you know, moments in horror movies, for example, where it becomes really clear to some of us, maybe many of us, maybe partly unconsciously, you know, that the problem with the family is coming from inside the building, right? That in a horror movie, you know, on the face of it, very bad, terrifying things are happening to that unit. Like, you know, we are under attack, we are being invaded, the home is being invaded or whatever, a bit like a nation under you know, under threat from racialized outsiders or whatever. But in fact, you know, there are all these things going on that make it kind of clear, particularly for certain populations, certain viewers, that the horror is the family, you know, and we have a hell of a lot of material like that in novels, in fiction, you know, and of course, you know, I value very greatly the more explicit attempts to, you know, speculate and fabulate beyond the private nuclear household, such as Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, you know, Marge Piercy, Joanna Russ, etc. You know, but overall, my sense of what utopianism as a method means is that we have to understand, even with the help of artists and you know, speculative fabulators, that there is, you know, a terrain ahead of us, you know, the manifestation of our desires, which we cannot really see or think yet. We have to, you know, stay with the trouble of not being able to know. Those blueprints that I mentioned at the beginning with Charles Fourier, you know, kind of giving you the plan for how, you know, people should live when we have broken free of bourgeois familiarity. You know, they're interesting kind of failed texts, you know, much like the kibbutzim, or indeed the whole history of attempts to build communism is a tragic, blood-stained kind of, you know, problem with which we have to contend and not flinch, right? I still dream and write and fight under the banner of something like communism with a small c, you know, but that doesn't mean that I, you know, I let myself off the hook for the vast history of, you know, deeply tragic, botched attempts, you know, to do something about, to do something alternative, you know. We need to, you know, this is a thing that Firestone was good at. Be willing to fail again. That's what the phrase, she, you know, daring to be bad, it has this dual meaning. Daring to be kind of, you know, hated, honestly. And I mean, not to make it about me, but, you know, obviously I have a hell of a lot of hate coming my way, not just from anti-abortionists, but frankly also from socialists and liberals, because of this visceral reaction we have to a proposition like abolish the family. But for her, daring to be bad was not just that. It was also, you know, daring to fuck up, you know, to make missteps, because the stakes are high, and the situation we are in is not acceptable. It might seem like it, but, you know, for her it was a kind of, it was a cage, you know, this kind of, and, you know, you can do a family abolitionist reading that sees everything as on fire and in urgent need of transformation in texts that don't necessarily come to the same conclusions. You know, Betty Friedan, very far away from that politics in her conclusions, but her prose about what it was like to live in a private atomized household as a housewife has a sort of incendiary potential, you know. And likewise, the people associated with wages for housework or wages against housework nowadays in particular don't talk about family abolition, but they're writing in the 70s, and this also returns to your beautiful remarks about love. You know, they were family abolitionist contentions. When that famous opening line of Wages for Housework, they say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. So what I think it's important to understand is the depth of the problem. What they didn't say is, they say it is love, you know, we say it is not love. They're not denying that there's love there. That's the problem. Capitalism steals and redirects and appropriates our love, our desires, the activities that we are doing in part to get free. And that's why, you know, the problem runs so deep. Family abolition will be self-abolition, you know, and that's why the cyborg is the right image, because the cyborg shows that, you know, woman is an invention of science and nature, she is an animal in motion. And the cyborg, I think, is a good heuristic for understanding how the threads of domination and colonialism and exploitation run right through our flesh and right through our relations with our children, right through our kitchens, right through our fingertips.
What you said before also made me think about the J.J. Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure as embracing failure, embracing non-success, turning your back into these capitalist criteria of success is a way to do anti-capitalist resistance. So I think also we could include the family abolition into that kind of like failure as resistance, or the, like you say, the horror, because that's also what you said about we are taught this stranger danger, but a lot of hazards are in the home, are into these interpersonal relationships or close affinities. So I think it will be really good if we can conclude our talk and open up for questions by a few words about, or maybe we can save that also even for the questions, that about insurgent care and how, how should we understand? I'm thinking of it like, again, as atomization or explosion of the idea of care, again, as a hierarchy. How should we understand that? Like you already talked about, your inspirations and the like critical thinking and the speculative thinking as a method, but can you say some concluding remarks about insurgent care?
Yeah, I think in many ways, different, utopians, whether or not they think of themselves that way, everyday weirdos and rejects from, bourgeois reproduction, have found ways to develop what they already unconsciously know, which is that reproduction is not really the right, it's not really reproduction, it can be insurgency. When we met, so when Audre Lorde has that phrase, those of us who were never meant to survive, that is the same logic I'm talking about, where for some, the making of continued life and of resistant life and of, in a sense, children, whether they are actually children or generationally, our co-products, that are throwing bombs at the reigning order, that reproduction is in fact a very strange word for the, anti-production of the present state of things. There's a poem by someone called Christy Nami Erickson, which it's called "My Son Runs in Riots," and it has a whole imaginary of a collective polymaternal force, a sense of mothers of all genders who do not recognize the distinctions between their children when they are running in riots, because, amongst other things, the carceral state, when it shows these bodies, does not distinguish between them. A black thug is a black thug, and you cannot tell the difference between them. But she is turning that on its head and talking about how the collective mothering of those rioting subjects is in comradely relation with them, rather than trying to enforce certain kinds of propriety or security upon them. She is talking about her very gestation of them as a kind of bomb making. So rather than reproducing for capital accumulation or reproducing for the acquisition of wealth and the bettering of your, not to say that there are extremely good reasons to want to climb out of poverty. That's obviously that's a desire I have, for example. But you know, the turning on its head of this notion of competitive striving via reproduction and procreation and inheritance, and the sense that you know, comradeliness might be a word we could use to encounter our children, you know, who are in a sense ineluctably and uniquely themselves and their own people, not something that reflects on us like a kind of, you know, copyright or, you know, or product actually. So yeah, so I think some people are already always practicing care as a kind of militant activity, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Let's see if there are any questions. If not, then I have some additional questions. Ida, is it right that I'm not seeing any questions yet? There was one of the times where I wasn't.
No
really...
questions so far.
Yeah,
No.
I can see. Okay, then I'm up to date. Okay, we have talked about, if I just sum up, also if some of you have joined us a bit later into this conversation, that we have talked about Sophie's book, Full Surrogacy Now, and Feminism Against Family, and that we are to understand family abolition, a concept that does seem very provocative to a lot of people, because maybe there is this literal understanding of somebody coming to take you away from your family, and it's not to understand as this utopian thinking about maybe we can expand the idea of family, and by that like turning it into pieces, or expand this othering of everything non-family, everything that is outside of the nuclear family, right? And the nuclear family as a metaphor for the nation state, because as we talked about, when people are asked to, for example, reproduce or bring more, it's often been, for example, the pro-natalist ideas often arise after times of crisis, where there is like this overlap between this breakdown of the family and breakdown of the nation by others. Yeah. So for example, if we take the United States history, I mean, I done some research about history of menstruation and how these menstrual diagnoses that were really close to hysteria historically have arisen through time. And it reminded me also when you said this thing about how witches in the time that, or people who were accused of being witches, were burned and prosecuted, how a lot of them had this non-nuclear family, non-heterosexual practices. And that also has a really long history back to hysteria in ancient Greece also was this idea that the uterus was wandering inside the body and blocked the way to the heart, which was seen as the center of thinking. And interestingly enough, that was a diagnosis often given to women who weren't married and who didn't have children. And the cure was for that was often get married and have children. And that is something that's really interesting, that even though this is something that is 2000 years old that we talk about, that even today, because I did an interview with a series of women who had endometriosis, which is a disease of reproductive organs, and yeah, that's what we call them, right? Reproductive organs. That's also very saying that the medical science calls it that. But a lot of people had this, even today, are told by their doctors that if you just go and have some children, that might cure. And it overlaps with people who, even though nobody, as officially there is no diagnosis called hysteria, it's still used informally in the healthcare system, that that a lot of, because it takes around, in average it takes 7 years to become diagnosed with endometriosis. So people have to go again and again and again, and some of them are accused of hysteria, or they are offered antidepressants, and some people end up actually in a self-fulfilling prophecy, developing depression because nobody believes in their pain. So what I found interesting in that was that these ideas of, for example, normalizing, for example, family, and normalizing reproduction and natalism comes often also from these external political factors. And that's how it gets me back to this diagnosis of menstrual diagnosis, or the whole as PMS, the premenstrual syndrome, started in the 20s, and especially it really like peaked when there was the big crash in 1929, the economic depression. So that was when these were doctors who said, well, if women stop going out, taking the jobs from the men, and if they stay at home, if they have children, that's going to cure that. And again, it came back after the Second World War, when all the soldiers had come back and needed their jobs back that had been taken over by women in the United States. They were again right. That actually really coincided with the new premenstrual syndrome that came there. So it's really interesting, because that was also another way, was like, okay, it's a disease, it's almost pathological not to have children. There was this gynecologist who said that menstruation is the tears of the disappointed uterus over not fulfilling its purpose.
Yeah.
So I think it's also really interesting to connect those dots on how this naturalization that you talk about has also something to do with a political ideology. Because one of the reasons, again, these were gynecologists, they were supposed to just write scientific books, but what they wrote was that the production, or what they call like the reproduction of babies, was a way to protect the nation against communism, against migrants from the South, against the disruption of family. So I think in that way, there is, like, if we want to go historically back and look at that, there is a long history of also like pathologizing non-reproduction, right? Or not wanting to have children. I think we have a question now. I'm going to read it out for those who can't see it. It's from Alice, that says, can you elaborate a bit on the relation between family abolition and the nation state? Does it make sense to abolish the family without also abolishing the nation state? Do you see the first as a necessary step towards the latter, or how are they connected? Really interesting question. Go ahead, Sophie.
Yes, in short, I think so. I think I don't know how to sort of conceptualize which components of a communization of the present, what order things take place in. The nation state is not something I theorize much in my book, as apart from kind of passingly talking about it as the model the function of the family, the precept in 17th century legal documents that, you know, each man's home is his castle, his fortress, was explicitly, and what's the second part of this? And it is his most secure location or something. I'm botching it, but the idea that the house is the fortress and the site of security was explicitly developed as an analog to the nation state, as a territory to be you know, provided for, right? That's one function of the nation state. The government is duty bound to feed the population, and to police, and is allowed to police its perimeter on that basis. And that was explicitly the model for the invention of the household in legal documents in Europe in the 17th century. But to be completely honest, the question of the nation state is one I have not talked about. And Nazila very, you know, astutely asked me to contemplate it and think about it in preparation for this conversation. So, you know, Nazila, do you have things you would like to add? Something you teach on, you know, families without borders. You know, I think you would have a lot to add in response to Alice.
Yes, and I think your question, Alice, was written also at the same time that I was talking about this, like the body, as the feminized body, as this form of, well, I see it, the feminized body as a sort of a metaphor for nation state or metaphor for land, because just to make it very concrete and not so theoretical, one example is if some of you might remember, it was just a few years ago that there was this incident in New Year's Eve in Cologne in Germany, that there was this a lot of articles about how some people who were described as Northern African, Middle Eastern refugees, they attacked German white women, right? And I think that is really almost a textbook example of how land, the nation state, and gender are connected, because a lot of these nationalist talks came out about we are being invaded, our women are being invaded. So there you see a really almost one-to-one comparison of land as property and then the gendered body as property, as something that can be like used to produce. Sophie, you called babies, for example, products when we talked about which I do agree, and you can see it as human capital. And so you can see in the way both the gendered bodies and land, and thereby the fiction of the nation state, like it's like imagined communities, for example, is very close to each other. And you can see it, for example, when in wars, also there is a lot of gendered violence, there's a lot of sexual violence, there are rapes, as a way of like symbolizing a kind of conquer of land. So in that way, I see, you know, and again, to use production and reproduction as a bulwark against outsider comings. And this is something we have brought up actually in every of these historical utopias, but I think it cannot be repeated enough, is when you talk about, for example, Europe as having low fertility, while at the same time you talk about everywhere, basically everywhere else in the world having too high or overpopulation, right? And I just want to say, as also someone who studied public health and within that demography, this idea of like reproducing a population is completely obsolete. There is nothing like, you don't need that if you have a fair redistribution of goods. right? So there's nothing called too many people or too few people. It's just a matter of political justice, which is a matter of also economic redistribution. So this idea of Europe doesn't have enough people for reproducing its workforce, that's completely obsolete. Even like in the most white universities or something, that's just, but still we just keep hearing these, right? So you can say, in this way of saying Europe is threatened and populations are being replaced. These are words, I'm just putting them in quotation marks because it's again fictions that are being told. So in that way, as seeing this as Europe as this nation that is threatened by invading others coming, and at the same time saying there are not enough Europeans, but there are too many of the others. In that way, you can see how the question of reproduction that always is gendered, how it becomes sort of connected or hooked on the idea of like the nation state, right? So in that way, gendered and feminized bodies become some kind of metaphors for borders.
Yeah.
Alice, I don't know if you got enough elaboration on that, but that's one way to see it. Of course, you can expand. Also, you can introduce for some years ago, I had this out of Jasper Poor's concept of homonationalism. I could really see this thing that I call the feminationalism is that again, when you and I know Sarah Ferris had did the same, like femonationalism, and I can see that it comes up again. For example, when the reproductive rights and the gender rights of certain white or majoritized so-called first world women become used as, again, this for like demarcation of the nation state. And again, I think we talked about it in our first conversation, Sophie, about also this idea of eugenics, about that improving the population, which is, there is a really long history of that in Europe. So again, reproduction, forced sterilizations, who has the right to adopt, for example, right? Who has the right to have children from other people, and not instead making sure they can be with their own children or do whatever they want. Who has the right? There is a really large like north-south hierarchy with that, and that north-south hierarchy is again very attached to this idea of nation states and the hierarchy between nations, this racialized hierarchy. So I think, I don't know if you have any comments on that, Sophie, or if we should take more questions.
I'm happy to send a list of authors, Carl, after the talk. Yeah, with relation to femonationalism, eugenic feminism, and so on, I think you covered the points I would have ventured less articulately than you. It's in my book, I use the framework of eugenic feminism, which is Asha Nadkarni's term, to structure my account. I mean, it's not just my account, obviously, of how, you know, the bioavailability of certain populations to be surrogate reproducers, people who assist the reproduction of others, is made possible, and narrated politically, economically, in the industry. I mean, some of my, I guess I didn't say this at the beginning, and it might not seem directly relevant, but you know, going back to the beginning of this conversation when we talked about how, you know, I am not making a defense of the surrogacy industry. I mean, certainly not in the sense that, you know, I condemn child rearing or making. This is a debate I have had with Donnay Haraway, who has this slogan, make kin, not babies, which I would like to problematize, thinking about why we suddenly in this moment with rising xenophobia and natalism, on the other, these things always being linked. Xenophobia is the same politics as domestic natalism, and why suddenly, feminists with anti-capitalist commitments are finding it possible to flatten out this stratification and to talk about a sort of generalized slogan, who should be not making babies, losing the specificity and the class antagonism and the dialectic there is really, in my view, quite problematic and structurally, almost racist. But what I also wanted to just remind, or say for the first time, is that I have a pox on both your houses approach. People who, promote surrogacy as sort of, yay, women helping women, choice, babies as an objective good thing, hooray, homo nationalism, families for gays, whatever. I criticize that very harshly, but I equally criticize a certain kind of resurgent bioconservative feminism, which I think is actually linked to the noxious forms of feminism we've just been discussing, which says, no, this particular industry which commodifies the womb is slavery, is an attack implicitly on a situation that is maybe okay or something. And it's not to say that the forward march of capitalism is not to be, I'm an anti-capitalist. I believe in fighting with workers where they are. This is the same kind of argument with the sex work industry. You cannot talk about abolishing something that grows out of the logic of the household. You can't just be, a prohibitionist and expect there to be emancipatory feminist results. When we criminalize one part of a transaction, as is done in the Nordic model, for example, criminalizing the buyer, you automatically, create extremely vulnerable and dangerous situations for the worker, who needs to be listened to. The workers need to be listened to in terms of what they want and need and fight for in and against their industry. Similarly, with commercial gestational surrogacy, it's not just, as I the things I said earlier that they're a little bit more abstract, and utopian. Let's reject the premise that children can be manufactured that belong to somebody else, right? I want to, stir up that presumption, and reject the notion. But also, let us just listen to the people involved. Let's talk about the workers on the shop floor who tend to just be completely excluded from the conversation as though they didn't have any politics or opinions, which is also not to say, by the way, and I realize how problematic this can be, that my utopian family abolitionist politics are shared, by surrogates. This is not the case. However, I want to, use the things that have been stated and demanded and bargained for. To some extent, it's small, but there are instances of gestational surrogates bargaining with their bosses, and their demands are not the demands that are put into their mouths by prohibitionist feminists who want to see them as slaves, essentially, right? But yeah, the reproduction of the race, what used to be called the race, is something that has always been kind of organized under capitalism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy in a deeply hierarchized, stratified and stratifying way. So we have, reproduction always being assisted, but assisted in a deeply exploitative way. So we have, you know, the assistance of some people's reproduction and the ideological promotion of some people's reproduction. Basically, more white babies with the right citizenship remains the biopolitical logic in many nation states, and the sort of desistance, the discouragement, and even the punishment via austerity, or the, you know, the destruction of ties of working class populations, indigenous populations, migrant populations, and so on and so forth, right? Deviant, degenerate, trans, sex working, and so on. Yeah, no,
Thank you so much for elaborating that. We promised not to go that much over 6:30, so let's take this last question from Stine Marie Jacobsen, and then give the microphone to Ida after that. So Stine asked, my apartment cooperative in Denmark wants the rights to sell and rent apartments to their children and family members, i.e. the family is used as a legal form against the broad family. I fear that family will be used to keep power in the future, so I'm very happy to hear this talk. My question to the speakers, how do they think we can avoid this family power in the future? And in continuation of the above, how do you see the legal future concerning family and property? Not necessarily children as property, but family as property in itself.
Yeah, wow. That's such a brilliant question. I'm afraid I don't really have a very good answer, but it generates a lot of thought. I've been noticing a certain kind of recuperative family critical discourse in amongst pundits, centrist, you know, commentators. So particularly with the pandemic, there's been an increase in people's sort of thought about the atomized private households, and to some extent a willingness amongst journalists to write columns saying, oh gosh, you know, I really get it now. I see that the nuclear family is a bit of a fiction. You know, what, without my nanny or my babysitter or my grandma or my, you know, my mom or whoever is helping, shit, you know, turns out, you know, it takes a village, you know, and then the conclusion is unclear, you know. In fact, the ruling class is, in some cases I've noticed, literally conscripting, and this is almost neo-feudalism rebooted, paid help that would be able to become a COVID bubble and cohabit in a sort of extended, you know, workplace household, like formal work, like waged household, right? In order to withstand the second wave of COVID or something, right? And simultaneously, we have journalists like David Brooks talking about the need for a return to the extended family. And that is something to think about in terms of the economics of neoliberal state strain. So, you know, houses he's talking about where grandparents are sort of annexed into, you know, a new form of nuclear household construction that goes back to the free care for grandparents, you know, inside the unit. And so you have an almost like a romanticized, nostalgic vision of extended family, but without any of the critiques, you know, that I've been talking about of marriage, of property, you know, of a sort of genetic fiction of unity based on blood. This thing you're talking about in Denmark, about apartment units with, you know, that's fascinating. I'm actually think, you know, there are anecdotes from the surrogacy industry of single men who have attempted to, you know, create, you know, 27 fetuses at once, with a view to actually having a voting bloc 20 years down the line. And it sort of sounds incredible, but there was a Japanese man who was hoping to literally increase his political power by having genetic progeny who could be depended upon to bolster his career, which is kind of wild. And that, you know, those pregnancies got intercepted or interrupted, or you know, but you know, it is a fascinating question that I think I will certainly give more thought to in the future. And we are in a world defined to some extent by dynasties. I mean, look at the Trumps, you know, and a lot of TV includes kind of dynastic logics. You know, I mean, I don't know if this was so big in Denmark, but everyone was watching Game of Thrones, which is a story about dynasty.
Oh yeah, it was.
You know, sorry, it's not a very satisfying answer. I think you're right.
I think it really is a really good question, and we can't reply thoroughly because, you know, I think, for example, what you see, family power. I mean, again, also I would like to say something disarming to people who have this like knee-jerk reaction to the word family abolition. It's kind of like the critique of marriage. You know, it's not like you want to attack the individuals who choose to get married. That's not the point in itself, but the critique of marriage is about that people who are not married often don't have the same rights, right? For example, and again, it gets me back to, for example, family or partner reunification, is that you have a different status if you want to have your partner here, if you're married or if you're not married, or you have to have at least be cohabiting for 18 months. So that's also like this idea of like a time and space that gets into hierarchizing love again, right? That maybe we can end on a note of that. And it's the same that I understand it, at least with the family, is not like somebody wants to come and take away your mother or your child or something, but it's about like, what about the people who don't have family or cannot be in that situation, or what about people whose family life is not recognized as family love, people whose love for their children is not recognized as love. I mean, we could go so much into that, but another very concrete example from Denmark is that very often children who are adopted get diagnosed with attachment disorders. It's like another of these psychiatric diagnoses that can proliferate from one day to other. But one of those things is, for example, or if it's some parents, and very often it's minority parents who are seen as that they don't have a normal way of attaching to their children. And one of the criteria is to have eye contact with the child, right? But then if you think about it in a non-universalist way, if you think about it in a multiversalist way, of that you can have contact with your children in so many different ways. You know, some people carry them on the back, and of course you don't have eye contact then, right? That this way of, again, using pathologization of the ways of loving each other, that's also part of this like family power, you could say. So so I think that that can be a way to say how family power can be disrupted, is to open it up to other ways, and not just one way to have a family, or to have what you call the kin or affinity or those things. So I also think I would like to, we don't have any more questions, so I would like to wrap it up. We've been really long. I don't know if Ida, you want to wrap it up for us, if you're around.
I'm here.
So
yes.
from my side, I'll say thank you to everyone, and thank you, Sophie, and thank you so much, Ida.
Yeah, well, I also just want to say thank you so much, Sophie and Nazila, for this wonderful conversation. And I really want to recommend that you all have a look at Sophie's book, Surrogacy Now. And there's also a lot of wonderful writing by Sophie available online. So go for it. I also want to thank all of you who stayed with us, all of our participants and listeners. If you want to revisit this talk, we will provide it with English subtitles and upload it on our website. And here you can also see recordings of the previous seminars that we have had. And then I just want to say that we hope to see you all for the last seminar in this Hysterical Utopia series, and that will be on August 27. And we will talk about decolonization of technology and an indigenous resistance with Mayasia Luke Jacobsen and Jenny Laiti. And I think that this will be really interesting. So I really want to recommend you all to tune in for that. And in the meantime, have a look at our general program, which can be found on our website and Facebook page. We have more talks and workshops that are relating to what we've been talking about tonight. So topics of care, technology, and resistance. We're also uploading artworks and texts every day by an amazing group of artists and thinkers. So I just really want to recommend that you all check out our website. But thank you again, Sophie and Nazila. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who are still with us. Just want to wish you all a wonderful rest of the day, wherever you are. It's evening time here and the family is calling. I hear we also have people that are saying goodbye in the chat to us, so we can stay with them a little bit. But thank you so much. Bye-bye.